Moss, and Agre and Berry.
The 10 o'clock news is made possible by your contribution and by grants from Nimrod Press, printers and engravers. From New England Telephone, 30,000 people serving New England's communications needs for more than 100 years. And from Shawmut, providers of financial services at more than 200 locations across Massachusetts.
For the second time this week, we find ourselves looking at pictures of devastation, amazed and thankful that no one died. In firefighting terms, this morning's fire in Revere wasn't just a fire, it was a conflagration. Somehow, no one died in the blaze, but 150 people were left without a home. And now investigators think they are looking for an arsonist. Alexandra Marks reports on the efforts to recover in Revere.
In the somber morning light, some neighbors watched the smoldering devastation stunned, while others couldn't believe their own luck.
Yeah, just so lucky, just missed it. Start from in front of my house and it flowed, it just hit second, the next mine and just passed around and to the behind me and the one I behind that one, it just all missed, all my house are missed.
The fire started in this abandoned building around 2:30 in the morning. Then the wind whipped it out of control and 12 buildings burned, 5 of them to the ground. Amazingly, no one was hurt. Some people got out on their own. The Red Cross evacuated others.
When some of the Red Cross volunteers got here initially on the 4th alarm, they started going through the neighborhood evacuating homes, getting people out of the homes. I think that saved some lives.
I smelled the candle burning, and so I see at the window and the fire come out. So I woke everybody up in the building.
No, got nothing.
So what are you going to do now?
I don't know. Sleep in my car. Only I got my car outside.
Do you know what you're going to do next?
I don't know.
The victims were first taken to the Jewish Community Center, then to the Revere High School for food, clothing, shelter, and Red Cross processing. With the Department of Welfare, they will find the more than 130 people left homeless temporary shelter for this weekend. And on Monday, they'll begin the process of trying to find new permanent homes.
What's happening is with the Revere Housing Authority is they do have a list of some available apartments. Also, they've been receiving a number of calls from people as to available housing, landlords who have an apartment. We've also put an appeal out on radio and television concerning if anyone does have available housing in Revere to please contact the Red Cross or contact the Revere Housing Authority.
Most of the victims are Cambodian refugees and new immigrants from Latin America, and many of them don't speak any English.
The most they worry about is for the long term. They don't know where and how they can stay about next 2-3 weeks.
Earlier this year, the city of Revere had applied for an $800,000 grant to help upgrade the housing and living conditions of the immigrants and refugees who live in this area. But they were turned down. Today, the governor said that decision will be reviewed.
It's unfortunate that it takes a tragedy maybe to turn that thing around, but I'm hoping we are going to get the grant, and I'm sure with the governor's assistance and the assistance of a number of state agencies, we'll be able to deal with this problem.
A state of emergency has already been declared, and on Monday, Reinstein will ask the legislature for emergency aid. He estimates it will take about $1 million to repair the damage, and he's hopeful the money will come through.
Half?
Yeah.
Okay.
There are other signs of hope, like Nina DeFreitas from East Boston. She heard about the fire and came with what she could.
Because I know the feeling. I went through it in 1978.
She
I lost everything. I know what they're going through.
Other donations of clothing, food, and money are pouring in, and the process of rebuilding is clearly underway. For the 10 o'clock news, I'm Alexandra Marks.
Although an apprentice engineer says brake failure caused his Amtrak train to smash into the rear of a commuter train Wednesday, federal officials say their investigation is far from over. Also, on Amtrak, the spokesperson says the train's brakes were checked at all stops along the Washington to Boston route and no problems were discovered. There is still plenty of wreckage in Back Bay Station and plenty of work to be done if the MBTA is to have things back to normal by Monday, as it says it will. Carolyn Sawyer has our story.
Construction workers delicately removed chunks of the 2 Amtrak locomotives. The threat of spilled diesel fuel could still be smelled in the air, although tense today's scene compared nowhere near Wednesday morning.
Excuse me, guys.
264 people suffered injuries when the Amtrak train rammed into the back of an MBTA commuter rail. Police, fire, and rescue teams worked late into the morning assisting the injured. Inspectors rushed to the scene to assess the structural damage. Many of those same workers remain on the job 2 days later, and work will continue through the weekend.
Everyone who's working down there is a person who's, been working 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 hours. So the cold weather just kind of slows things down a little bit.
He gave us a location so we could get the notes right, but...
Even MBTA staffers show signs of wear during daily briefings inside a bus right outside the Back Bay station. MBTA officials say it'll be late Saturday before they know what Boston commuters face Monday morning. And most cannot wait until things return to normal.
I'll be happy when it's back in place, yes.
MBTA police have cornered off the entrance to the damaged tracks to protect the public's safety. The investigation continues, but so does the question of who will pay for this cleanup.
Until we really know more about what actually happened and what the liability is, it's a little bit hard to speculate.
Glenn sees the case likely headed to court, but his immediate concern is to get all MBTA trains back on track. For the 10 o'clock news, I'm Carolyn Sawyer.
The car insurance rates for 1991 were announced today, and once again, the squeeze is on. On the average, the state-set rates are going up by 7% next year. If it makes you feel any better, it could have been worse, although critics say it could have been better. David Boeri reports.
Your actual rates will depend on your driving record, your coverage, and where you live. But on average, car owners will be paying $50 more than this year's premiums.
So it's really the amount of cost per claim that's causing this increase, and it's more or less in line with inflation.
Insurance Commissioner Timothy Gailey says some of the high cost of insurance in Massachusetts is unavoidable. Bad weather, lots of drivers, and crowded roadways, for instance. What can be avoided, he says, is aggressive driving, insurance fraud, which is estimated to involve as much as 30% of damage claims, and the highest frequency of accident claims in the country.
It's there. It's the major factor in our high rates. If we were able to change that claims frequency, if people made fewer claims, you'd pay less.
In raising the rates by an average of 6.9%, Gailey gave the insurance industry only half the increase it wanted. Good news? Not to public interest consumer attorney Josh Kratka.
I think our reaction is the same as the reaction every consumer is going to have, which is, I'm paying so much already, how can I pay another 6.9% a year or $50 a year? It's just injury and added to injury.
Like the commissioner, Kratka says most of the state's drivers are good ones. Over half have no tickets, no accidents. But he says the good drivers are still paying the freight for bad ones.
People talk a lot about downsizing government now and making it more efficient. People are paying about as much for insurance as they're paying in taxes, and we should be talking about making the insurance industry more efficient, downsizing it, making it more competitive, and making it more affordable for people.
Kratka and Masspurg, the organization he works for, want to introduce competition and subject insurance companies to antitrust laws. Of course, insurance companies do make an inviting target, and in turn, they blame drivers. And this year, the state split the difference. For the 10 o'clock news, I'm David Boeri.
Scientists said today that strong winds swirling around the South Pole are helping to fill in the hole in the ozone layer. In Boston tonight, we've got light winds and starlit skies. Overnight lows will be in the wintry low 20s. Tomorrow, the clouds move in, and there's a good chance of afternoon snow. Highs in the upper 30s. Tomorrow night, the snow should change to rain. Lows will be in the mid-30s. Sunday, the clouds disappear, but the wind picks up. Highs in the mid-40s. And now Africa. The U.S. armed guerrilla organization and the Soviet-backed government of Angola announced plans to lay down their guns and study war no more. After 15 years of civil war, where over 300,000 people were killed, warring sides agreed to set a date for free elections and then immediately sign a ceasefire. The breakthrough came after a flurry of meetings this week in Washington, including an unprecedented session between rebel leader Jonas Savimbi and Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed to stop sending weapons once a ceasefire is signed. The sides also agreed that international peacekeepers will be sent to Angola under the auspices of the United Nations. Still to be settled, however, are differences over the nations which will take part. In South Africa today, members of the African National Congress were still celebrating. After 30 years in exile, ANC President Oliver Tambo was home to preside over the first meeting on native soil since they were outlawed. Nelson Mandela did not mention sanctions, but Oliver Tambo suggested their stand be reviewed.
While de Klerk and his colleagues have had to accept and go along with the ANC's initiative for a peaceful solution, there is a simultaneous attempt taking place whose purpose is to destabilize, undermine, and if possible, crush the ANC and its allies.
It is no longer enough for us to repeat the tried slogans. We should therefore carefully re-evaluate the advisability of insisting on the retention of sanctions given the new developments in the country and abroad.
The ANC meeting falls during a holiday in South Africa known as Heroes' Days. The Dutch Boers on that day celebrated those who defeated the indigenous blacks in South Africa. Our guests are native South Africans who now live in the Boston area but keep South Africa close to their hearts and minds. Rose Moss is an author who recently published Shouting at the Crocodile, chronicles the treason trial of 5 black political leaders known as the Delmas trial. Agre Mberi teaches at Roxbury Community College and is an active member in the Boston-based Fund for a Free South Africa. To both of you, starting with you, Rose Moss, all during Nelson Mandela's historic U.S. visit and his visit here in Boston, over and over we heard the point driven home: keep the pressure up through sanctions. What do you make of Tambo's statement that it needs to be reviewed?
It's inevitable that the focus of energy in South Africa has to turn to building a new society. And I see that as epitomized in this call for looking in a new direction, looking for ways to construct a new South Africa, getting away from the feeling that the main point on the agenda is still struggle.
Agre?
Yeah, I agree with her, and I think it's also because of the fact that the economy is in shambles in South Africa. There's a high rate of unemployment in the black community, so I think that decision was made based because of those unfolding conditions. And then internationally also there's also now a lack of commitment towards economic sanctions.
Might some of the more cynical among us look at Oliver Tambo's return home to South Africa and see the potential for some kind of rivalry or split between Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo?
I don't think so, because they've always worked together. In fact, they've always worked together over 50 years. The members of they formed the ANC Youth League in 1944. They've been together as law partners, 1952. And in fact, Tambo was sent out to form the external mission of the African National Congress. And Mandela was told to stay inside South Africa.
But you don't hear two voices, though. Nelson clearly saying keep the pressure on, and Tambo saying something else.
He said that when he was here on his visit. But recently he has also made a statement that I think we need to reconsider the whole issue of the economic sanctions because of the economy being in shambles in South Africa, and as well as try to placate those people who are saying that economic sanctions never worked or outside.
Tell us a little bit about Heroes Day, Rose Moss, and whether or not, with a lot of new heroes on the landscape, that there might be room for a little more inclusion.
Heroes Day used to be, as you said, a celebration of Afrikaner victory over black people in South Africa. It's been transformed into a holiday that really attempts to celebrate the many different types of heroes and the many heroes in South Africa, and begins to include some of the heroes who are fighting for the new South Africa, like the people in the book that I've just published, Terra Lakota and Popo Malefi. And it's a holiday now that is going to create a new history for the new society that is coming into being.
You're suggesting a more inclusive South Africa, or
Yes.
just more people celebrating different heroes?
An inclusive South Africa. This is the real major story in South Africa now, that it's not simply transforming the society from being dominated by one group, the Afrikaners, into being dominated by another group, which is the fear of many of the whites that a little group of Africans will dominate. There's another ideology coming to birth in South Africa, and it's an ideology of inclusion and democratic process. It's not what hits the headlines, but it's happening all the time, being built. And I think Heroes Day is helping to create that.
You're nodding in agreement. Can this really be?
I think that's what we're trying to achieve in South Africa, a new democratic future in which all people, without regard to race, color, or creed, are part and parcel of the society.
One thing that has dominated the headlines recently, the black-on-black violence, and seemingly the government and the leadership, black leadership's inability to come to grips with it. And key in all of that is the question on many people's minds why Nelson Mandela and Gacha Buthelezi won't meet on the issue.
Yeah.
Your reply.
Nelson Mandela represents the African National Congress, and the National Executive Committee doesn't want Nelson Mandela to meet with Gacha Buthelezi.
Why?
Because Gacha Buthelezi, as far as we're concerned, has been part and parcel of the problem in South Africa. He has accepted balkanization, the tribalization of the African community under the policies of apartheid. Many of our people have been killed. Zulus in Natal have been killed. We've stood against him. What he wants to do is to bludgeon his way into national political prominence by meeting with Mandela, and we don't want to do that.
Is it time, Rose Moss, for the two to meet?
I think it is time, but I would like to say something about black-on-black violence. When 90% of the people, more or less, are black, and there is violence, what do you expect it to be? I'd also like to point out that in New York this year, according to the New York Times, 2,000 people have been killed. This is in one metropolitan area. In the whole of South Africa this year, although the events there have been tragic, about 1,000 people have been killed. So one needs to look at this picture of violence in perspective, and also in the context of the history of South Africa. What is being changed is a 300-year history of profound domination marked by tremendous personal suffering. In the Delmas trial, for example, there was an incident where the youngest defendant, Melindi, said that his father didn't have papers to live in the area that he was living in. One day when he and his brother came in from playing, they found a policeman questioning his father, and his mother was saying, "I don't know this man, he's a stranger, he has a right to be here." The policeman turned to the children and said, "Do you know this man?" And Melindi said in court that he had said, "No, this man is a stranger to me." And then he had to stop testifying because it was so painful to him to remember that he denied his father, even to protect him. Now, the feelings that happen in that kind of transaction are not to be simply waved away. And for many people, the way they are dealt with now is through violence. Inevitably, in a revolution, even the American Revolution was full of violence. That kind of transition can't be accomplished without violence. My hope for South Africa is that it's not going to last too long.
We shall continue to hope. Rose Moss, author, Professor Aggrey Mberi, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Revenge is in the air in Israel's town of Jaffa. Mobs today took to the streets, stoning cars, assaulting Arab passers-by, and clamoring for vengeance. This after Palestinians stabbed 3 Jews to death in an aluminum factory today. They sprayed Muslim fundamentalist slogans on the walls before fleeing. The police minister, Ronnie Milo, promised unprecedented measures, including use of the death penalty. Capital punishment is on Israeli military law books, but is never imposed. Milo said he would also limit the hours per day that Arabs from the occupied territories can stay in Israel. Moderates are blaming today's murders on the failure of Arab-Israeli peace moves. Turning to the crisis in the Persian Gulf, President Bush made it clear today that he's reaching the end of his rope with Saddam Hussein. Mr. Bush wants Hussein to meet Secretary of State James Baker by January 3rd at the latest. Hussein continues to insist that he won't meet Baker until January 12th, just 3 days before the United Nations use of force resolution takes effect. Mr. Bush is so mad at Hussein's stonewalling that today, for the first time, he said he just might ask Congress to authorize an attack against Iraq. But Mr. Bush insists he's still looking for a peaceful settlement.
In offering to go the extra mile for peace, however, I did not offer to be a party to Saddam Hussein's manipulation. Saddam Hussein is not too busy to see on short notice Kurt Waldheim, Billy Brandt, Muhammad Ali, Ted Heath, John Connolly, Ramsey Clark, and many, many others on very short notice. And it simply is not credible that he cannot, over a 2-week period, make a couple of hours available for the Secretary of State on an issue of this importance. Unless, of course, he is seeking to circumvent the United Nations deadline.
Are you saying if Saddam Hussein won't meet by January 3rd, there simply will be no meeting?
I'm saying that we've given him 15 dates, and he ought to take one of them. I don't like to draw deadlines in the sand here, but there'd have to be some compelling reason for me to change it, because I don't want to move this up against the United Nations deadline. If you'll read the UN resolutions, you'll see that he should be totally out of Kuwait by January 15th. That's a massive undertaking.
The Gulf crisis wasn't the only thing on the president's mind today. He announced this afternoon that Illinois Representative Lynn Martin will take over from Elizabeth Dole as head of the Labor Department. Martin would have been out of a job come January. She lost her bid to unseat incumbent Senator Paul Simon. Today, Bush called Martin, quote, a distinguished public servant and a cherished friend. Organized labor, though, is less enthusiastic. The head of the AFL-CIO said today that her voting record in Congress doesn't show much sensitivity to workers. Another defeated Congresswoman, Patricia Saiki of Hawaii, is Mr. Bush's likeliest choice for Education Secretary. Mr. Bush also needs to find a new Republican Party chief. Conservative Republicans said today that they don't trust Mr. Bush to pick someone to their liking, and they're betting that the president will face a right-wing party challenge in 1992. For the first time in 7 years, Nancy Cruzan has been in what her doctors say is an irreversible coma, kept alive only by a feeding tube. And for the last 3 years, her parents have been fighting a complicated legal battle to have that tube removed. The Cruzan's case went through the Missouri courts and on up to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed with the state's ruling that the Cruzans needed and didn't have, quote, clear and convincing evidence that their daughter would want to die. Today, based on new testimony that Nancy Cruzan did not want to be kept alive by machines, a Missouri judge decided that the Cruzans can remove the feeding tube. And what the Cruzans must now decide is when to ask the hospital to stop feeding their daughter. It could be as early as tomorrow. And finally, at the rate of the 12 cents an hour he earns working at a medical center, it will take a miracle for former televangelist Jim Bakker to pay a $130 million judgment. A Charlotte, North Carolina jury ruled today he owed the money to contributors to his Praise the Lord, or PTL club. Bakker's already serving a 45-year sentence for fraud and conspiracy. The forewoman said jurors agreed Bakker defrauded his flock, but they didn't feel he was a racketeer, a finding that automatically triples damages. Disappointed plaintiffs, led by a former Bakker follower who spent $2 million of his own money on this case, plan to appeal. And that's our news. I'm Carmen Fields. Have a good weekend. Good night.
The 10 o'clock news is made possible by your contribution and by grants from Nimrod Press, printers and engravers. From New England Telephone, 30,000 people serving New England's communications needs for more than 100 years. And from Shawmut, providers of financial services at more than 200 locations across Massachusetts.